Today I have a special guest for you guys, Michael Reed, and he is like my guru, my teacher. So I thought it would be great to bring him on this channel to explain to you guys about the basis and basic aspects of astrology. So, Michael, go ahead, take it away. It's all yours.
Oh, well, I think it's important for people to understand what astrology is, which astrology has been around for a really long time. That's the interesting thing about it, besides many other interesting things, is nobody knows really where it came from. We don't know anything about the origins of astrology, but we know since time immemorial, people have been looking at the sky and trying to understand what's going on by looking at the sky. And probably the earliest types of astrology were observational astrology. That people would look up at the sky and draw some sort of relevance between what was going on in the sky and what was going on in their life. So astrology can be used for so many different things. I think the most important thing for understanding its use is the use of self-understanding and self-knowledge. Because when you understand yourself, you understand why you're having all these experiences going on in your life. But really, when it comes down to it, you can look at astrology to understand when financial high times and low times are coming, when relationship lows and relationship highs are coming, when success periods are coming, and when low success periods are coming. But I always feel that just understanding that is understanding too little. I think we also need to understand why.
Yeah.
I often like using the analogy of explaining that if somebody smokes cigarettes, right? Like if somebody smokes cigarettes, they can go to a doctor and they can ask the doctor to give them something for their cough. And sure, the doctor can give you something to alleviate your cough. And then you'll be back short time afterward to deal with alleviating the cough again. And the doctor can give you something to alleviate the cough again. But eventually, if that doctor is not kind of helping you recognize that probably the reason that you're coughing is because you smoke cigarettes, then that doctor's kind of abnegating their responsibility as a doctor.
Right.
It's important to understand why things are happening in your life too. And astrology also excels at the why is this happening in your life.
So tell me a little bit about yourself, Michael. Tell me how you got into astrology and how many years you've been doing it and so forth.
I think I often joke with people and I say, at this point in my life, I'm having to do backwards mathematics, which is going, okay, how old am I? And that's the first part. That's really hard, to go, how old am I? Because then I have to do backwards math for that. And then I have to look back at when I think I remembered that I started doing something. So I can say, with pretty much certainty, I don't have the exact year in mind, but it's been over 25 years at this point. Yeah. So I always had an interest in astrology. I can say that first and foremost.
Yeah.
And then when I began to explore alternative types of spirituality, I got deeper into astrology. And at one particular point, as a housemate, I had someone who was a professional astrologer. And would look at charts that they had lying around their office, so to speak, people that I didn't know who it was, so it was not really a breach of confidence or anything like that. And it was just this thing of going, wow, this is all really interesting. And, I would notice things in it and pick some things out and, just happened to be around it. Sometime after that, he decided he was going to do a radio show, and I had experience in radio, so I ended up working the control board for him. And so learned a lot about astrology that way.
Right.
And sometime after that, I tried all sorts of things in my life, because I was on a path of being a healer, and so I explored Reiki for a while and began to do that for a while and had a certain degree of success with that. But then that kind of waned after a while, and it really producing what I was looking for. It was like I had a upward swing of success with it, and then it kind of went back down again. And then I explored teaching Kundalini yoga for a while, and
That's pretty cool.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
that's
enjoyed it, and had a certain level of success with that. But the success with that would go up and down, and eventually, I lost my yoga studio that was in the front room of my apartment.
Oh my
Because
God.
the landlord decided to raise the rent because I did such a good job polyurethaning the floors.
Oh my God.
Which is a life lesson. Never
Yeah.
polyurethane the floor.
Yeah, if you have a corporate lease, don't
And if you do a really bad job, okay?
He's like, yeah, I can get better. I can get higher rental. So,
Exactly. But the real lesson being there that ended up like kind of reaching an end at a certain point too.
yeah.
And so when that happened, there was this I had an experience where I had a reading from a Vedic astrologer, and I sat down in the chair with them, and they asked me a few questions about my father, which I answered.
Mm-hmm.
And they then told me that I was born a minute and 10 seconds earlier. And I was like going, how could they know that? Right? Because I didn't know anything about the fact that, in Vedic astrology, we use these things called divisional charts, which are more fine tuned. So a difference in birth time of a couple of minutes can sometimes make those divisional charts be a little bit different. So he was checking things against that. And so I was just amazed by this. And so since I was already interested in yoga, I began to learn Vedic astrology and re-encountered my old housemate from years before.
Oh.
And he all of a sudden said, well, I've got a waiting list about 6 months long. Do you want to jump in? And so that's how it started. And it was just pretty much immediate. And that was the one thing that in my life, even though with astrology too, I again had a down point. Things took a downward swing for a while, but every time during that downward swing that I tried to do something else, it just didn't work out.
Yeah, I know. I feel the same way. I obviously I told you that I have a background in computer science and accounting. And, when I was younger, I had a lot of spiritual experience, and, but I kind of went off of that track to go into like, all right, I need a job. But I really, once I had my spiritual experience around that time, I don't know, I just didn't have the mindset to do it anymore. I didn't feel comfortable doing that role. So, and now I'm in this path. So, and I feel happier actually. It's all about being happy and feeling comfortable what you do.
Definitely. And it was the same with me at a certain point. I had, prior to doing astrology professionally, I had all these different jobs, but they all ended up, and no offense to the people who employed me at that time, but they all eventually ended up feeling meaningless because they weren't really my path. It was somebody else's path. And so it wasn't working for me. But when I got into astrology, it was working for me. Yeah. And then it stopped working for me. And then when I tried to make something else work for me, it didn't work for me. And so eventually the right time came along where it just, poof, it started, working again, and things immediately went on the upswing. And it's been there ever since. Yeah. Sometimes when here's the thing, and I find this happens a lot in life, that we sometimes think that because things aren't working out, that we're on the wrong path.
Yeah, I agree with you.
But sometimes when things aren't working out, we're on the right path.
Right.
Because we're being tested to see if we believe that that's the right path or not.
You're right about that. I'm up here. I was up there studying for my CPA, and I'm like, oh my God, look at the trees. It's so beautiful. I can't concentrate. It was horrible.
Right.
Yeah. So I totally agree with you, Michael. I know I've been there, and I've been in the same position, and now I feel very happy, with doing this. And I've always felt like I wanted to help people, but, didn't know how that was going to happen. And you go through a lot of different things. I also went through the Reiki path and, doing a lot of different things, regression therapy stuff and all that kind of things that I got into. So you have to find your way, and you have to find your path and find what works for you.
I think you're saying something very meaningful there, because in my line of work, and I'm sure you encounter it too, I encounter a lot of people who earlier on in their life, they're frustrated because they haven't figured out who they're gonna, like what they're supposed to do yet.
Yep.
And sometimes figuring that out doesn't happen early on in life.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we feel this pressure on us by society to figure out who we're going to be and what we're going to do at an early age, and it doesn't always work that way.
Yeah, and you're
And
worried
that's
about,
okay.
yeah, well, your family is going to think this if you go this way.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're worried about those kind of things, and you're like, oh, am I going to make enough money to support myself and my family and so forth?
Exactly.
It's a journey for sure. It is. It really is. And that's another reason why it's really good to get a good astrologer early on, so that you can figure out, okay, this is what's going to happen with you. This is more in the path that you should take, you know, this is the way you should go with it. So that's another good reason to talk to Michael about it.
Well, thank you. But, you know, that's something that's there too, you know, because you can look at a horoscope chart and you can see, for instance, if I'm looking at career, I can see, well, this person is really meant to be a musician in life.
Mm-hmm.
But then you see that they're a janitor.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And what's going on in those instances is the person just hasn't reached the right period in their life where musician has blossomed yet.
Yeah. Good point.
And so they feel this potential inside of them, this potential that's pushing them in a certain direction, but then they feel like they're not getting there. And so some people never get past that getting there part.
Yeah.
Because they give up and they stop believing in themselves. And then when that period does come along, when it's meant to blossom,
they think, well, that's the point.
They've given up already, and they're able to take advantage of it to less of an extent than they might have been able to take advantage of it previously.
Yeah. I do think that we get like certain signs that we should go in certain directions. Like I know when I was younger and I was a teenager, when I was a child, I heard certain things that I was exposed to, and now that I realize later on now, like, you know, that I'm in this path, that, you know, basically that was the way I was supposed to always go, you know, like tarot found me. It wasn't something that I found, you know, I found my uncle actually got me my first tarot card deck when I was 14. So it's something that, you know, I've always kind of been into, you know, throughout this whole time. It's just that, you know, I thought, well, I have to get a job. I have to support myself. I have to make money. I have to be a part of society. So I can't go that way. You know, I used to love astrology, you know, and of course I didn't know what I know to the extent now about astrology, but I've always been into horoscopes, astrology, and so forth, just like I'm sure you have, if you've noted. But it wasn't until, you know, I, you know, got deeper into my spiritual path and I had my spiritual experience that I really delved deeper into those things.
Mm-hmm.
So Michael, I know a lot of times we talk about on my channel about the rising sign, the moon sign, the sun sign. Can you tell me exactly what those make up and why those things are so important to us?
All three of those are self-oriented factors. You know, in understanding a horoscope, really every planet is important on a certain level, but every planet constitutes a different aspect of your being.
Right.
But when you're talking about the sun, when you're talking about the moon, and you're talking about the ascendant, you're talking about the I would probably use the phrase self-orientation factors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's understand the ascendant first, which is, you know, one of the things in the horoscope that's going to give most differentiation. I'll explain that. So,
Okay.
you know, if you have two people born on the same day,
right,
they'll both have the same sun sign. Okay.
Right.
Those two people may have a different moon sign, dependent upon if the moon enters a different sign on that day. But
right.
over the course of the day, the ascendant is going to go through all 12 signs.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that gives a higher degree of differentiation. So the ascendant, quite simply put, when the sun rises,
mm-hmm.
the ascendant is that sign that's on the horizon at
mm-hmm.
the time of your birth.
Right.
And here's a really interesting concept, so that's the eastern horizon. So we're going to say east is over here, even though it might be a little bit backwards. I don't know which way's north. I know that's up and I know that's down. That's about as far as I can go with that. All right. So the ascendant is the sign that's on the eastern horizon at the time that we're born.
Right.
Now, directly opposite that is the descendant.
Okay.
So let's talk about the ascendant. The ascendant is the self.
Okay.
It's your perspective. We look at it for a lot of different things. We look at it to understand you. We look at it to understand your body. That's another thing we look at it to understand. And we look at it to understand your perspective, because it also relates to the head and how you think. Now, directly opposite that, on the western horizon at the time that you're born, is the descendant, which is the same as the seventh house, which equally the seventh house indicates relationships.
Right.
Okay. It's the other. So that's a really interesting concept, because here's the self, here's the other. We're constantly going towards that horizon. But over the course of our life, that horizon is continually elusive, because if you try a simple experiment, which you could do your whole lifetime if you wanted to, but I don't really recommend it unless you want to travel the world, is you can keep walking towards the horizon and see if you ever reach it. And you never will, because it's always, pushed further and further and further.
Is the purpose of the descending sign, is that more or less your opposite, so that, basically you can correct those things within inside yourself?
That's a good way to understand it. But it's interesting too, because a few different houses, the seventh house being one of them, are what are called the Kama houses in astrology. That's Kama, which means desire houses. So the seventh house is a desire house. It's like we get pulled in that direction. It's almost like, we're hypnotized in going towards that. Interestingly enough, the seventh house also indicates foreign countries.
Really?
Yes, exactly. It's that point that's always directly opposite us. And so in going back to the self-related factors, then we understand that the ascendant is the self. That ascendant through its life is, suffering from a certain level of incompletion, which it begins to explore other in its life, whatever other might be, just the other things that go on in its life, so that it can become more whole. The sun, if you want to understand the sun, you have to understand a concept, at least from the perspective of Vedic astrology, called the Atman, which quite simply put means the soul of everything. But in addition to that, it relates to your own soul. So the sun relates to our soul. But in understanding a little bit of differentiation between the sun and the moon, we have to understand how the soul experiences life. So we come into this life with a certain set of conditions or experiences that we're meant to go through.
Right.
Okay. So the sun also, it relates to liveliness, because the sun is what gives us life, right? So the sun equally relates to your body, but it relates to the vitality of your body and your immune system. And when that sun burns itself out, or when the soul has completed its journey, that's when your life ends. But in addition to that, the sun relates to our specific soul path, and influences to that will relate to our specific soul path. But the sun in Vedic astrology is a very dry planet. So let's explain what that means. Dry planets just accept things as they are, and they kind of expect everybody else to do the same. So the soul just knows that, well, at this time in my life, I get married. At this time in my life, I have success. At this time in my life, this happens. It doesn't judge quite as much the ups and downs of that in an emotional manner. It just goes, this is what I'm here to do. The sun also relates to those things that we'll sacrifice for.
Right.
So if you know a little bit about astrology, you can look at what house the sun rules in your chart. And that's one of the things that you're most interested in sacrificing for.
Interesting.
Okay.
Interesting.
but you know, basically the sun just goes through experiences.
Yeah.
It's steadfast. It's willing to sacrifice for its kingdom, which, by the way, is Leo. So you'd have to look at where, you know, where Leo falls in your chart to understand that. Moon's very different. The moon is something called manas, or our sensory mind. So with our senses, we see things a certain way. You know, we have smell, we have touch, you know, we have sight, we have our hearing. Sometimes our senses can deceive us.
Right.
So if you think astronomically, what the moon does, it helps with your understanding of the moon, which is the moon reflects the light of the sun.
Right.
So our sensory mind is meant to reflect the light of our soul.
Okay.
Right? We're meant to perceive things correctly, perceive true reality in our life,
right,
things the way that they are. But we wax and we wane with that. So sometimes we're able to do that to a greater capacity, and sometimes to much lesser of a capacity. So the moon is very subjective.
Okay.
Whereas the sun is just very dry. The moon is very subjective and very emotional and reacts to things in a certain way. Understanding some of the qualities of the moon in Vedic astrology, the moon has what's called a creeping form, which basically means that it will do anything to have its needs fulfilled. Because the moon, primarily relating to our sensory mind, is about fulfilling our needs as we perceive them. And so we adapt over the course of our lives to, you know, fulfill our needs. But sometimes we make mistakes in that capacity. But all three of those things are important components of the self.
Okay. So there's not one particular part that's more important than others. It's just that the ascendant is for how outwardly people see us, and the body, is that also representing the body, the ascendant?
On a certain level, and in addition to how other people see us, whereas the sun is the soul, the ascendant will determine those areas of life that the soul's journey will play itself out in, because it determines where the houses are, which the houses, what they relate to in astrology, are the various areas of life. Like the 7th house is relationships, 10th house is success, 5th house is children. So without an ascendant, then you're there's less of a capacity to do that, unless you make the sun the ascendant or the moon the ascendant, which is also possible. And you can get some information from that, but not as precise as you can with knowing the birth time, so you can do the ascendant.
So guys, well, when I say rising sign, moon sign, sun sign, you get more information. That's what Michael's talking about. This is a more complete picture of what's going on with you. So, and then also we talk about, you know, the Venus sign and stuff to do with the partner. So Venus and Jupiter and so forth. So what is the purpose of those particular planets in our chart?
Well, aside, you know, Venus definitely relates to spouse, and Venus can relate to relationships for anyone. Because, let me see if I can explain it this way. One of my favorite ways of explaining the planets is understanding them as a royal court. Okay? So the sun is the king. The moon is the queen. Right? So you have to have a joining together of the soul and the sensory mind. By the time we get to Venus and Jupiter, you're dealing with the advisors.
Right.
Okay, so Venus is the advisor in material affairs.
Right.
Venus is the planet that would tell the king or somebody else, and you know, who's part of the royal court, would tell them, this is what you need to do to really enjoy your life, or this is what you need to do to make this go well, right?
Yeah.
And so relationships are one of those key areas that we're looking to enjoy our life. We're looking for fulfillment through another person. So Venus relates to, you know, our capacity to go through that and be able to do that in an enjoyable manner. And dependent upon the sign that Venus is in, it's going to do that in a different way. So for instance, Venus in Taurus is more of a fixed sign, and it's a fixed sign associated with Venus. That, for the most part, all other things being equal, will make the person, very loyal in their partnerships. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Venus in Scorpio may make the person very pleasure oriented in
Mm-hmm.
their relationships. Venus in Pisces understands some of the deeper tonalities of love. Their love is more, spiritual oriented, and that's why Venus is exalted in Pisces. So
Right.
you can understand a person's approach to relationships in general by understanding Venus. But in Vedic astrology, we also specify a natural specific planet for relationships for each individual gender.
Mm-hmm.
So Venus can be used overall for relationships for either gender, but at the same time, if you want to get more gender specific, then Venus is used as an indicator for relationships for men, and Jupiter is used as an indicator for relationships for women.
Mm.
You can also look at those things on an individual scale as well.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so another thing that there's a lot of people are confused about on my channel, and I'm sure when they watch other tarot card readers, is, okay, are people using the tropical zodiac or the sidereal? I mean, there's a difference, right? I know you use both, Michael. So can you explain to us, like, what is the difference between the two, and like what is the importance of each of those?
Yeah, I can do that. Actually, what I do is I use a tropical zodiac with sidereal nakshatras. And nakshatras they're related to the fixed stars, but there's something that's different than the zodiac. And there's a lot of misunderstanding with that, but I'm not going to go too deeply down that rabbit hole, so to speak, okay? So here's the difference in a nutshell between the tropical and sidereal zodiac. I'm going to use my microphone here.
Okay.
Let's see if I can get my fingers oriented the right way. Okay, good. So you see how my finger is up and down here?
Right.
So for those of us who are in the northern hemisphere, when we're experiencing winter solstice, the sun is down south.
Right.
When we're experiencing summer solstice, the sun is up north.
Mm-hmm.
For people who are like, in Australia, that flip-flops. They have summer. They have summer when the sun's in the south and winter when the sun's in the north. But the reason I'm illustrating this is the path of the sun from our perspective here on Earth moves north, south over the course of the year as it journeys from solstice to solstice. That particular pathway of the sun is called the ecliptic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about what the tropical zodiac is first. The tropical zodiac will mark the signs of the zodiac in relation to seasonal changes.
Okay.
So the cardinal points of the zodiac relate to the changes of the seasons. So sun enters Aries at spring equinox. Sun enters Cancer at summer solstice. Mm-hmm. Sun enters Libra at autumnal equinox, and sun enters Capricorn at winter solstice. Okay, so that stays static over time. It's the same, every year with the seasons. Right. Whereas the sidereal zodiac, what that is doing is it's taking those 12 equal portions of the ecliptic and it's mapping them to the constellations. Right. But that is not a relationship over thousands of years that stays the same. Mm-hmm. It changes, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a specific calculation that's called the Ayanamsha that's used to determine the difference between the tropical zodiac and the sidereal zodiac. So there are two different systems that are used. I would probably be somebody who's called a relativist. So in other words, I have my own system that I use, which is tropical zodiac with sidereal nakshatras, because I find it's more accurate for me. But I equally have friends who are sidereal astrologers, and they're accurate in their work. So I think what's most important is that an astrologer is using the tools that help them to help their clients the most effectively.
That makes sense. So guys, just to clarify, so like, you know, when you have your sun sign and you're looking at your horoscope, okay? So he's talking about tropical. So
Yeah.
that's what the tropical is. So sidereal is something different. There's a big debate going on saying that, I know Michael had spoken to me about this, that it's 29 degrees off. I thought it was
No,
only
24
degrees
But you
off.
know, if I can interject there, each Ayanamsha is different, you
Mm-hmm.
see. So the 24-degree difference is related to something called Lahiri Ayanamsha.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at other different Ayanamshas, it would give you different degree differences, like it might be 23 or over 24. And that's something that changes over time. So it really depends on which Ayanamsha that you're using. It's just most people who use the sidereal zodiac in Vedic astrology, they use Lahiri Ayanamsha, which generally, for the most part, creates like a 24-degree.
Right. So what does that mean? So let's say your sun sign is Gemini. Then you look at your Vedic astrology, your sun sign could be Taurus. It'll go back one sign. So you just have to be aware.
It may, dependent upon what degree it's in. But if you're using a tropical zodiac with sidereal nakshatras, that's a completely different system. What we're doing is we're using basically your planets as per using Western astrology would stay the same, but we're adding the sidereal component of using the nakshatras into the equation, which are always sidereal.
Right. That makes sense.
But that equally is the Vedic system of astrology too. And some people might argue with that, but I don't like getting into that argument or debate. I think it's just, you know, important that people use what works best for them. And
That's true.
when I switched to the system that I'm using, it was a bit of a shock to me that it was working better, and it took a lot for me to change. So I tested things pretty thoroughly before I did that. So.
Right. So how important do you think intuition is to reading someone's chart? Do you think it's very, very important to have strong intuition to be able to be a Vedic astrologer?
Here, you know, I think that's a really good thing to talk about. But at the moment you said that, it brought up another thought that I want to add into that conversation, which is the most important thing in an astrology reading is the connection between you and the astrologer. So the more aligned that connection is, and that's something that just naturally happens.
Yeah.
You know, a seasoned astrologer will know or will see that in a chart, but that's something that just naturally happens because you're gravitated to go to a particular astrologer. But when there's a natural connection between you and the astrologer, that intuition is just naturally going to switch on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But intuition.
Their energies, right.
Yeah,
right.
Definitely. But intuition is very important. But equally important is technique. You know, so for instance, like, you know, you're doing tarot. So intuition is very important with tarot, but if you didn't know anything about the cards, then, you know, you wouldn't be able to.
The technical aspect of things. I absolutely agree with you.
Exactly. But so with astrology, it's important to have good analytical techniques too, that if you do them over and over again, they're known to reproduce close to the same level of accuracy that you're comfortable with. And astrologers will learn a multitude of techniques over their career, and they'll generally gravitate towards those that produce them the most efficient, concrete results. So in astrology, it's important to have that analytical side, but in addition to have strong intuition, because let's say for some reason your analytical mind's not working so efficiently.
Right.
Well, if you've got good analytical techniques anyway, they just kind of come second nature, like riding a bicycle, which is an intuitive process anyway. But in addition to that, if you are just using analytical techniques and you see something that your intuition is saying, you don't just want to discount it, right? You want to explore it and see if analytically, if it's making sense, right? So it's important to have the intuition too. But if you just had intuition with no analytical techniques, sometimes your intuition might be off. So let's say you are doing a reading for a friend of yours. It's very difficult in those particular instances to separate intuition from subjectivity.
Hmm.
And so in instances like that, it's important to have good, concrete analytical techniques too. So I would say with astrology, both are very important. But if you have less of one than the other, then, it's going to diminish dependent upon how imbalanced those two things are. Yeah.
So what are some of the uses that people could use astrology for? Like, give me some examples of what you could use astrology for.
Well, I would say, first of all, pretty much anything. Okay, you can, because if you're going to an astrologer who's been doing astrology for a decent amount of time,
Mm-hmm.
they will know how to find the answer to a specific question.
Right.
So, most commonly people go to astrologers for the things that people go to, people who read tarot cards for. So
Yeah.
anything ranging from I want to know when I'm going to be successful, or when things are going to get better financially, or when relationships are going to go better. And all those things are the important things that we desire in our life.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, those things are associated with the desire houses like we were talking about before. But you can really use it for anything. With Vedic astrology especially, I do a lot of readings for people who are wanting to know where they're supposed to take their career path.
Right.
Or I've had some very, complex questions too. I've done a lot of things for lawsuits for people. I think the one thing I steer away from with people is I don't believe an astrologer should ever go into the death thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
With
Yeah.
one exception. And this is the only time I ever go into looking at things like that, is I had a terminally ill patient once contact
Right.
me, and they were pretty much ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
And they were wanting to know when the relief was going to come.
Oh my God. Okay.
So that's the one time that I'll look at something like that. But with that, I'm checking it pretty rigorously. But really, you can use astrology for anything. I've looked at lawsuits for people. I've looked at health-related things for people. I've looked at really complex family dynamics, for people, like ones looking at people's stepsisters and fathers-in-law and brothers-in-law and their interaction with some other, person. And in astrology, you have to know what means what. But really, once you know what means what, you can pretty much do anything, just like picking up a musical instrument. If you know music theory, if you pick up a musical instrument, you go, okay, well, this key makes this note, this key makes this note. So now I know how to play it already.
Mm-hmm. Same thing with programming. It's the same thing. Like all programming languages are very similar in nature. And so if you learn one, then you can pretty much pick up another one. And same with languages. People don't understand how everything's so interrelated.
Oh, definitely.
Everything is interrelated, for sure.
Language.
So
it's about language, and it's like learning expression,
Exactly. So I know we had talked to you about the fact that you have different relationship aspects. So what kind of things can you cover in that area, as far as like what do you do as far as your readings go with relationships?
Well, I've done the most common thing that I do that I don't necessarily offer a specialized consultation for is quite often I get contacted by people who want to know when they're going to get married,
Mm-hmm.
or people who want to know when they're going to have a relationship. And that can be fit into the context of any reading. But I do offer 3 very specific types of relationship consultations.
Mm-hmm.
There's one and each one of them also will tell you when the next relationship is coming up for you. So my favorite to do for people is the one that gives relationship karma,
Mm-hmm.
plus relationship capacity,
Mm-hmm.
plus predicting when a relationship's going to happen. Because quite often when people are contacting an astrologer, it's because something's wrong.
Right.
They're feeling that their relationships aren't going well, or they're feeling lonely, or they're having trouble getting into a relationship. And so understanding relationship karma gives you an understanding as to why that's there.
Right.
what might be blocking you in terms of relationships so that you can do the work necessary in order to release that block that's there.
Mm-hmm.
I do another consultation that's the relationship capacity
Mm-hmm.
consultation, which basically looks at your main birth chart plus two very specialized charts called the D7 and the D9, or as we call in Vedic astrology, the Saptamsha and the Navamsha. And that's used to determine like what's going to work best for you in relationships and what's your potential for having successful relationships.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to the original consultation I was talking about, which is the karma capacity plus when the relationship's going to happen, it puts together the relationship karma plus the potential for successful relationships plus when the next relationship is going to happen, so that you can do the self-work necessary in order to make things work better for you. But
Right.
if somebody wants to, they can just do relationship karma plus, when the next relationship is going to happen to, or they can do, relationship capacity plus when the next relationship is going to happen.
So how important in that situation is free will? And because I know when I do my readings, I always take in consideration that everyone involved has free will. So that can change dynamics of things. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to change the concrete result, but it can, change exactly how the circumstances are going to happen. So does that happen a lot in astrology as well?
Well, free will definitely plays a role. I'm of the mindset though that there's no difference between free will and what we would call God's will. I think they're both one and the same, but I think that we have free will, or the illusion of free will, so to speak, because
Right.
we have to interact with our karma, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we take steps, it does influence outcomes. So in other words, you can be somebody who just goes through life as what I like to call the zombie approach, like
Yeah.
things just happen to me, or and interestingly enough, maybe that's not a fair assessment, because occasionally you do see charts where individuals just have a life that's more fatalistic,
Yeah.
and it's difficult for them to really kind of deal with that. But we're meant to engage on a certain level,
Mm-hmm.
because engaging helps you to resolve your karma. So a good example of this is if I'm looking at somebody's chart and I see that they have little capacity for a relationship, or maybe somebody's contacting me because they've met somebody and they want to know if it's going to turn into a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm looking at that and I'm going, okay, well, this may not work out, or the two of you are not compatible,
Mm-hmm.
the number one thing I'm going to ask the person is, do you love this person? And is this something that you want to pursue? And in
Mm-hmm.
that instance, even if it's not going to go down the, happily ever after path,
Mm-hmm.
it's important to engage in that anyway, because there's something that you have to gain from that relationship. And then you go back to the age-old saying that it's better to have loved and have lost than never to have loved at all.
Exactly. I agree with you.
And so free will is very important. And so if you're looking at your horoscope, or if you're coming to me for a relationship karma reading or a relationship capacity reading, and those results there are showing things that are problematic, it's not that you're just meant to give up. It's that you're meant to work on those things that are creating the hindrances. And to the extent that you work on them, that's the level to which your success in those areas begins to increase.
Mm-hmm. What was the other question I was going to ask you? So let's just go over this. So do you give advice for certain people of what they can do? Do you have because I know in my readings, if I see something bad that's going to happen, I'm like, okay, so what advice do you have for me, Spirit, and what to tell them? Does Vedic astrology have stuff like that can give people advice on what they can do?
It does. Quite often, that is looked at as more of the remedial aspect of
Mm-hmm.
Vedic astrology. In Vedic astrology, quite often, things are given like mantras for the person to do, which is mantra. If you separate those two words, it kind of means mind wave. And
Right.
usually it's a chant that the person can do that's meant to attune them to the energy of a planet.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing you can do. You can also give the person affirmations to work with. I kind of do that quite often. Another popular thing is gemstones, but with gemstones, they can sometimes produce difficult results at the same time they're producing positive results because they're very powerful on a certain level. And in addition to that, I'm a strong believer in somebody shouldn't have to spend money to to work on their karma, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
But my favorite way really to give advice to a person is to just look at the energy of the planet that's going to be helping them at that time, or look at what's wrong and offer advice on how to begin to work on themselves to correct that.
Yeah.
But I think that we always have to understand that we're going through an experience for a reason. And
Right.
I find out there quite often there's the approach to life that, well, the planets are creating this in my life, so I have to do this, this, and this to avoid it. Right?
We look at the negative aspect of it. Yeah.
You can try to work on something. Definitely working on things is very important, but if you don't first accept that the problem is there in the first place, then you're ignoring the reality of the situation, which if you pay more attention to the reality and accept that, that gives you the tools that you can work with to solve the problem in the first place. And so I think I get a lot of people who come to me who will go, right, I know that this problem in my life is because of this planet or that planet, but I feel like I'm working on it and it's not going away. And sometimes just because you're working on something, it isn't always going to go away, but that doesn't mean that working on it isn't important.
Yeah. As we had spoken about before, God helps those that helps themselves.
Exactly.
To yourself, just don't expect, okay, it's just going to happen this way. Sometimes, you have to take certain steps to make things happen in your life. Just like you go to school and you get your degree, you're taking a step to go into that direction. You're just not automatically going to get that degree. There's certain steps that have to be taken. So, and just like, dealing with planetary karmas and so forth, you can do a mantra, and it doesn't necessarily mean you have to use a planetary mantra. You can use your own kind of affirmation to gain over that. Like, so for instance, do you have any examples, Michael, of like what a person can do as far as like some affirmations that they can help themselves like improve?
Well, it depends. It depends on the circumstance, first of all, is what I would say. But if we're just looking at simple concepts, right? So for instance, if I'm looking and there are problems with perhaps a person's Jupiter, and that Jupiter is causing them to make poor decisions because it's afflicted in the chart, then I would be, telling the person I focus on only making good decisions in my life.
Right.
Yeah, to remind themselves of that, to work with it. And in Vedic astrology, there are so many different things that could be causing the malady or the problem.
Right.
And so sometimes there are subtleties that you have to tune into to help the person. So for instance, there's one thing in Vedic astrology called Digbala. So when a planet has weak Digbala, that person may have potential with that planet, but they don't know how to direct it. So for instance, if the problem related to to Digbala, I would, be giving them more like that affirmation I just told you, because then that's helping them to focus on directing it and focusing on the directing the aspect of that planet rather than other subtleties which might be involved in the equation.
Okay. I don't want to take up too much more of Michael's time. So do you have anything else that you want to add, Michael, about the whole reason people should, take some classes in astrology or get an astrology reading?
I think the number one reason, especially if you want to study astrology, is to understand yourself. Yeah. If everybody understands the word yoga, like, most people, when we think of yoga, we think of people doing exercises on a mat. Yoga is really from a Sanskrit word, which means union, right? So anything you do can be yoga, like playing the guitar, that can be yoga. Anything which kind of unites you with yourself. Astrology is one of the highest forms of yoga because it helps you to know yourself. It helps you to understand your weaknesses and what you need to do to strengthen them. So I think that's the first reason to get into astrology. But it's also when you become adept with working with astrology, which good Vedic astrology classes can teach you, after, practice, of about a year, if you go to a good teacher, it can teach you how to look at your own chart in an objective manner
Mm-hmm.
and, make judgments so that you can understand when difficult periods might be coming up and what you need to do to approach those.
Mm-hmm.
Same goes for getting an astrological consultation. It's good to understand the source of the problem that you're facing.
Mm-hmm.
But equally, I would say ages ago, I used to not be that into prediction,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak. But then I recognize prediction serves a very therapeutic purpose too.
True.
Because before we can, like if you have a cold, sure, you want the thing that's going to help you to, cure that cold, which is resting
Yeah.
and, taking lots of vitamin C and things like that.
It's about prevention too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But at the same time, you want something that's going to get rid of the symptoms. And prediction deals with the symptoms. So if you're dealing with both the symptom and equally the root of the issue,
yeah,
then you're dealing with the whole problem. Yeah.
Right.
But I think if you isolate one of those things without the other, then you're dealing with more of a potential of a problem persisting for the person. So I always try to, in my approach, I always try to offer guidance as to why this is happening for an individual, in addition to when is this happening, or
right.
is it going to happen?
Right.
All those things can be determined. I would say, if anyone's interested, probably the most difficult things to predict through astrology, but with the right techniques you actually can, are things like marriage. And here's why. Because with marriage, we need to understand what differentiates a person meeting a relationship partner or a person having an important relationship experience,
right.
or a person actually getting married.
Right.
And so with marriage, the reason marriage is so difficult to predict, pardon me, on some levels, is because you need to find a period of time where there's a lot of relationship transits happening in close proximity in a time period that equally is showing that it has the potential to create a marriage. Because when somebody's getting married, there are usually several different important relationship things that are happening over the course of a month or several months. So that's one of the things that delineates that for the individual. The other thing that's really difficult to predict but can be done is if somebody is going to have children and how many.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
But believe it or not, that is something that actually can be done through astrology if you have good techniques. So anything's possible in astrology. You just need to know how to find it.
Right.
Or how you need to go to an astrologer who's going to be able to find it for you. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Michael, thank you so much for coming to my channel. I really appreciate it. Please, guys, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. And also check out Michael's website, his classes. He has a lot of great options for classes, and he has a lot of great reading options for you. And as you saw, astrology can be used for so many different aspects of your life. So thank you guys so much. And thank you, Michael, for coming on to my channel. I really appreciate it.
Oh, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you.